This is Chapter 2, Section 5, New American Nation at War. So after July 4th, 1776, the United States became a new independent nation. But you can't just do that and expect everybody to recognize that you did that. Great, they declared the United States as an independent nation. The colonists declared that, kind of told the world that, but the world's like, okay, what next? And so England certainly didn't recognize that they were their own country just because they said so. England had other opinions about the matter. They were still colonists under British rule and believed them to be, rebels at this point. So the colonists were going to have to fight for their independence. They were going to have to earn it. And this is known as the Revolutionary War. That's the war between the colonists and now, the United States and England. So the colonists now become Americans, now after they established the United States. But it's a war between the United States and England wants them to remain colonies under English rule. And the United States is fighting to keep themselves independent from England. So, to fight England, at the time, England was by far the most powerful country in the world. The United States was going to have to form a new government and fast. So the colonists at the time, when they said, it was very brave of them to say, on July 4th, 1776, to start their own country. Great, yeah, we declared it. But it's one of those things like you and what army? And they honestly didn't have a formal army. They had militia. Each state kind of had like their own kind of national guard, their militia protecting their state. And, if the governor needs something done, but there was no formal army. And they were going up against the greatest military in the world. So it's a tough task, almost impossible task to some people. So each colony now was called a state, as you can see here. Now that there was 13 colonies, now there's states. And these fundamental laws, and so each state created their own constitution, which constitution just means fundamental laws that are established by a state or country that the state will be governed by. It's kind of like the law of the land. So not like after July 4th, all the delegates went home. They formed their states. They're no longer colonies or independent states. So that's why it's called the United States, because you have a bunch of states combined. You have these separate entities combined to form one country. So all the delegates went home and they all formed new state governments because they're no longer ruled by England. They needed a new government. So in these state constitutions, there were some limiting powers. The colonists did not want to replace England with another strict and powerful government in the colonies, now the states. They just got, in their beliefs, they just got rid of, they just wanted to become independent from strict rule. They're not going to implement new strict rules now. Governors of each states had limited power and limited terms. The governors had to be elected. And most states' constitutions had those three branches of government that really Baron de Montesquieu outlined. A legislative branch, which is the representatives that make the laws. Then there's an executive branch, which is the governor that enforces the laws. And then the judicial branch, which is the court systems that interpret laws. So these 13 individual state governments were formed. But there needed something to unite all the states together to be able to fight England. They couldn't do it each state alone. So the colonists, now the United States, needed to create a government, a national government. But they were fearing that creating a strong national government would just be the same thing that they had with England, and they feared that a strong national government was going to violate their rights as well. So the Second Continental Congress that formed the Declaration of Independence got together again to establish a central government among the states. And then they met in Philadelphia again in 1777. So this Second Continental Congress met again, and the delegates argued on issues of how many representatives from each state, who would make up the legislature. Now they didn't have a ton of time because they pretty much just declared war with England by making themselves a separate country. So they had to make some decisions fast, but they did argue about some key issues. Larger states like Virginia, they wanted the amount of representatives based on population. The more people you have, it should equal the more representatives that you have in government. Kind of makes sense in theory. But the smaller states said they would have zero voice in government, such as Rhode Island. They wanted equal amount of representatives from each state. So at the end of the day, they rushed together, came up with the Articles of Confederation, which is a compact, which is an agreement to make and obey the laws for the welfare of the group between the states. So all the states agreed on this Articles of Confederation. The Article of Confederation had just one branch of government, the legislative branch, and each state would just have one vote in the legislature. They kind of did this so they can get things done quicker. They were at war, they had to set up an entire government, so they needed to get things done. The legislature was known as Congress and would hold the power to declare war, make treaties with foreign countries, establish trade agreements, but did not have the power to tax the citizens. So it was kind of concerning where the money to run this national government would come from. And most of the power stayed with the state governments. That's kind of what they were fighting for. They wanted, the whole time they wanted states' rights. They wanted to be able to govern themselves. So the United States government during the Revolutionary War, they needed to borrow a large amount of money from other countries to pay for the war supplies to fight the Revolutionary War. It's really expensive to fight a war. They needed, uniforms, guns, cannons, horses, food to feed the soldiers. So they were just kind of throwing everything together, and they needed money quick, so they borrowed a bunch. And so even though the central government had little power, the states did come together because at the end of the day, they wanted to win the War of Independence. They knew they had to come together for this central cause. And so really George Washington is credited for uniting the Continental Army. And the Continental Army is called the army of the first army of the United States. The colonists, they were called the Continentals. And so he was really credited for uniting the soldiers and be able to defeat the British soldiers using effective strategy, even though he was being outnumbered. Now, this Continental Army was formed by volunteers. They were fighting for their independence from England, but these soldiers just lived terrible throughout the war in terrible conditions. There wasn't a lot of money, there wasn't a lot of food, there wasn't great housing. But through all this, they were outnumbered and outmatched. But the United States Continental Army still won the day and gained their independence. Pretty much England got tired of fighting the war, and the Continental Army won enough battles and forced them out. And the United States was also allied by France, so it worked out. So this is just some pictures of some of the Revolutionary War. This is at Valley Forge. This is probably at the lowest point. You see the soldiers just ragged from fighting, barely their uniforms falling apart. This is George Washington. How the heck are we going to win this? And so that was probably the lowest point. But they got their stuff together. And, this is kind of the Continentals fighting against the British soldiers. At that time, they were still fighting. They would face each other and fire their muskets into each other's line until one retreated. But the United States Army won. They won the day. So after this war, great, we won. Now what? So United States was in great debt after the Revolutionary War. United States had a really hard time paying back these debts because it didn't have the gold or silver to back up the continental dollar. Not to get into a big lecture on how money works, but pretty much what this is, and even a dollar bill, is just a piece of paper guaranteeing that the government has this money backed by something actually worth something like gold or silver. Now, so the United States government at the time, they were printing out, this is a $55 note from the Continental, called a Continental, saying that, hey, this is $55. This piece of paper is worth $55. Now, if you don't believe that the government has $55 to back that up with, then you might not be it might not be worth a lot of money, and people won't want to trade with you. So since the United States couldn't regulate trade in the states, the economy decreased. It was kind of like a free-for-all. Nothing was being, standardized, and so the economy just was tanking after the war. They just owed all this money, and so that's where the states kind of had to come up with an idea to raise taxes. Because remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the government could not tax the people. And it was no wonder why the central government wouldn't be allowed to tax the people, because remember, this all started with England overtaxing the colonists, and they got mad about this. So they definitely didn't want a central government doing the same thing England did. So what the United States did was the states themselves would tax these farmers really high, and farmers were struggling. And so some of them had to sell their land because they couldn't pay this tax. So in Massachusetts, these farmers, led by a Revolutionary War hero named Daniel Shea, led this rebellion to force Massachusetts government to stop these high taxes on land. This was getting ridiculous. So he gathered this group of men, and then what they did was really storm the Massachusetts government. Their point was to overthrow the government. It was really scary at the time, and there was really no army. The United States Army was disbanded after the Revolutionary War to really stop them. The police and everything like that really wasn't really formed yet in some parts of the colonies. So this was something new. Oh my, we have this group here, and they're kind of getting kind of violent. Who's going to stop them? And since Daniel Shea was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, Massachusetts militia didn't want to get involved because they respected him. That was their comrade during the war. So they had to send in the New York militia to stop them. So they were eventually disbanded. But why Shea's rebellion is important, because this word that this violent rebellion spread throughout the state of Massachusetts. People were feeling, well, we need a strong national government to keep law and order in these states. That was ridiculous. So also, a strong government could solve economic problems and make tough laws to get us out of debt. And this is what they needed. So Americans really agreed that the United States needed to establish a strong national government if we want this new nation to survive. That concludes A Nation at War.